The Square Ball Podcast.
Hello there and welcome to the show. Dan here from The Square Ball along with Michael Normanton. The show is brought to you in association with Levi Solicitors, our sponsor, a long-time sponsor who do all sorts of stuff, Michael, including
Wills Probate Conveyancing, the big three. Employment law. Dispute resolution.
Yeah. I mean, if you've got, for example, a contracted employee who's, I don't know,
difficult,
refusing to do the job, or whatever, you can maybe
any difficulties,
contact Levi Solicitors. levisolicitors.co.uk/The Square Ball for a 10% discount on your legal fees. Angus Kinnear is here, CEO of Leeds United. Thanks for coming in. Appreciate it.
Pleasure.
I think before we get into it, we've learned a little bit from experience now of doing these over the last couple of years. We want to, I think, lay out our approach a little bit just for the benefit of the viewer and the listener, because one of the most frequent comments we get, or criticisms, is you were too hard, you were too soft, you didn't ask X or Y, didn't challenge something enough. And I think we want to say from our point of view, we can't possibly get everything right in everybody's eyes all the time with something like this. And obviously, because things have not been great, should we say, in the last year or two at the club, it's quite a sensitive time. It's more delicate, a bit more sensitive than the last couple of years, because basically people are pissed off with what's happened. So we understand that. There will be people wanting us to really dig you out on this, but we're here to have a conversation. I think it's easy on forums, Twitter, in the stadium to shout or be behind a keyboard, but we're in a room, there's three of us in a room. We just want to have a chat, and hopefully that's all right. And we will do our best to ask you the questions that people want answering. We can't speak for everybody. It's just not possible to do it, and we've got a limited time, so we'll just do our best.
Well, in saying we just want to have a chat does sound itself vaguely threatening. It sounds like the sort of thing you'd say to someone as you guide them down a dark alley. But
yeah, and we don't speak for anybody but ourselves. We can't possibly represent all Leeds fans. We know that. So just forgive us any shortcomings in this one, and we will do our best with it. And with that in mind, first question is then, why do this? Because it would have been easier not to, wouldn't it?
It's definitely easier not to. I think it's it's become an annual fixture. So I think the year that you have a really challenging year like we had, and it was miserable for everybody, is not the year to shy away from giving the fan base the answers that they deserve. I think we were conscious not to do this during the transfer window. I know that'll be a point of discussion. I think we talked halfway through and said we wanted to be judged at the end of the transfer window, but I think it's increasingly difficult for clubs, particularly when you're not winning, to find constructive ways to share the challenges and the decisions that you're making within a football club. Because if you're not winning games, everything that you do is bad, and that's what we've seen. When we were winning games under Marcelo, everything that the club did was brilliant, and when we're not winning matches, everything that the club does is viewed entirely differently. So I think it's a good opportunity to review the last year, to talk about the decisions we made, what we got wrong, why we're not going to get it wrong again, and also talk with some positivity about the year ahead, because I'm really excited about it.
And you understand why there is a breakdown in trust with the club based on what's happened. The results are everything, aren't they? At the end of the day,
absolutely. The being a custodian of a club is difficult because there is only one real metric that matters, and that's results on the pitch. And we can do fantastic things with a foundation. We can drive our commercial revenues. We can we can sell more shirts. We can do brilliant work in the academy, all of which I think we've done. I think there's lots of things over the last 6 years where the trajectory continues to be upwards. But we all know that we're going to be viewed through the metric of whether we won football matches, and winning 7 matches in a season is miserable for everybody, and it colours absolutely everything which happens around the club. And that's why the mantra within the club, and particularly for this season, is football first, and we've got to start by getting things right on the pitch.
Do you agree that things have basically spiralled out of control since Marcelo Bielsa was sacked? Is that a fair statement? And then can you talk us through what's happened there at the club since then, from your point of view?
I think there have been. I don't think it's spiralled out of control, but I think there are a couple of factors which have made things really challenging. And the first one is trying to replace a manager who had as much success and played as great football and connected with a fan base in such a special way that Marcelo did. And lots of clubs have found the transition from somebody who's been particularly successful to a new manager really difficult. And we knew it was going to be a difficult transition, and we wanted to make the right decision, and it didn't work. And I think that has, on the pitch, has caused us issues that the Premier League is so unforgiving once you get those things right. Everybody, when you speak to sort of my counterparts in the Premier League, they know you are one one managerial appointment, if you get one managerial appointment wrong, if you're in the bottom half of the league, you have a very high chance of going down. Similarly, if you have a bad window and the players you recruit don't work, you have a very high chance of going down. And both of those things I think coincided last year, which made it particularly challenging. And I think from a supporter perspective, and perhaps the sort of sense that things are spiralling out of control, is probably linked to the fact that we've managed to coincide getting relegated with a fairly challenging ownership transition as well. And I think if we had, a long-term custodian in the shape of the 49ers, and maybe they bought it a year earlier, then perhaps the fan base would have been more relaxed not relaxed, but they would have felt more confident about the ability to return. But I think from a supporter perspective, I see how they perceive things going wrong on the pitch with a lack of certainty from an ownership perspective, being a position where the club was out of control. But I don't think we are. I think we're back in control, and I think we've still got a very strong foundation for the season ahead.
So just back to the appointment of Jesse Marsch, and he was sold to us as the natural successor to Marcelo Bielsa. But to my eyes, the players didn't look fit enough. They looked undercoached, stressed, funnily enough. Is that fair? Was he in what way was he a natural successor to Marcelo Bielsa, who was built on possession? And even early analysis like Moscow, our colleague Moscow, picked it out immediately. The Red Bull mantra is to give up possession, and we saw that immediately. The players looked terrible in possession.
Yeah, I mean, it was. There were certain things that I think Victor saw from a technical perspective when he was looking at coaches, which showed that there were some synergies. Now it was very difficult to. I mean, we all know Marcelo is he's the definition of unique in every aspect of his personality and his football outlook. So trying to find anybody who was going to be able to deliver in the same way he did was going to be difficult. But we certainly saw from Jesse's pressing stats, from the running stats, that we thought he was going to be able to leverage the fact that the team was really fit. We thought that was an important part of his game. I think you're right. I think the fitness did fall away, and we didn't expect that. We thought the pressing was going to be done in a more pragmatic way. So we thought that there were some challenges in the man-to-man approach, which was at the time resulting as having some very significant losses in lots of games by lots of goals, in a way that I think the opposition had worked out what was happening, and we didn't have a way to combat it. So we thought that Jesse was going to bring a more pragmatic style of play, which was perhaps going to be better adapted to the Premier League when you're playing against stronger opposition, and perhaps you respect the opposition a bit more. And clearly it didn't work for a number of reasons. And I think partly Jesse would say, and Jesse worked very, very hard for the club. He was very committed. He was, as he said, he was always all in. He was devastated to lose the role. But sometimes it's a combination of timing and the players that they have available to them. And I remember when we hired Paul Heckingbottom, and everybody told me it was a disgraceful decision, a disgraceful hire, and he was a low-level coach and not befitting of Leeds United. And yet 2-3 years later, he's getting Sheffield United promoted on a budget far less than we spent at Leeds United when we got promoted. So I think we have to. I think Jesse would hold his hands up and say that it didn't work. But he had a very, very good track record as being a coach. But we have to accept it. It failed, and it also failed from a recruitment perspective. And I think Jesse would point out that the two managers that followed him didn't do any better than he did. And I think we struggled with the loss of Calvin and Rafinha. One of the things that Sam Allardyce said when he came in was that he felt the club lacked any world-class players, and he said in the Premier League, even the worst teams normally have one or two kind of world-class players, whether that's a Maddison or a Ward-Prowse or a Tielemans. And I think we lost those in Calvin and Rafinha that we had to sell for both football reasons and financial reasons. And the theory was that in the transfer window we would be able to spread that income across a number of signings and be stronger in more positions. And because those signings didn't work, then we weren't.
When did you feel it started going wrong for Marsch? Because it felt, obviously we had a decent start to the season, but it felt as early as the Leicester game that it probably wasn't working and maybe wasn't going to work. But from the kind of understanding we have from the club side is that he was very much Victor Orta's man. Victor was backing him pretty much to the end. So when did you feel maybe we've made a mistake here?
I think there was, so we had some early good signs. We had a good result against Chelsea, which perhaps flattered to deceive a little bit because then everybody had a good result against Chelsea. But at the time, that felt like it was a good result. I think in the run up to Christmas, we all as a board were thinking that we were in a difficult position and the trajectory wasn't moving in the right direction. You have to remember that I think Jesse did a good job in the season that he joined and when he kept us up. We're in a difficult position, and he fought and won games that we perhaps didn't think we were going to win, and he kept us up. But I think there was after the initial couple of games, I think we were very good at home to Arsenal as well. A game I think we should have won, and there was some positive signs there. So when we put Chelsea and Arsenal together, it looked positive. We then had a significant dip, and I know you've discussed it on the show. It was probably the Bournemouth and Liverpool games at the end of that period before the international break, where again we thought perhaps we were moving in the right direction. Perhaps if we hadn't have had those two results, we might have made the decision earlier.
Do you think that was a failure of management though, by not making that decision at that time? Because the majority of verdicts I think about that time was that, look, this is probably not working going into the World Cup break. It was the perfect, given the number of breaks we had in the season, surely it's a failing of management if you don't act at the right time to give yourself the best chance of turning this around.
Because the Bournemouth game was a win, but it was a fairly disastrous, unstructured performance. They could have been going in with another couple of goals before half-time. So it felt like
it was fluky. It was a fluky late win, wasn't it?
And it felt like, actually, particularly looking back on it, you look back at Marsh's first season and you have to attribute staying up to some fluky wins as well, because the Wolves game, which ultimately that 3 points made the differences of us staying up. We were going nowhere in that game. We were not breaking them down. We were getting it. They looked like they would score probably another couple. Then all hell breaks loose. There's a red card. The whole game changes on it. But it feels like that if we're calling Marsh's first season success, it's essentially boils down to one player being sent off.
The margins of success, if you're to define it as a success, were so minimal and so narrow that it's very, very hard to call it either a success or a failure, isn't it?
I think he came in with a task for a team which generally around the club we felt we were in a very difficult, we were in a very difficult situation. The feeling around the club, both in the dressing room and in the medical team and in the board, was that we were in having a severe risk of being relegated. And he came in and it was I don't think it was ever expected that we were going to then romp to safety. It was always going to be very fine, and he did it by fine margins. But ultimately, that is his job was to keep us up, and he did that.
But there are recent examples of look at what Villa did by bringing in the right manager in the form of Emery, and he took them from a position which I think was below us in the table at one point and took them up towards European qualification.
It absolutely happened. So I mean, if you look at the stats of when you make a managerial choice, a managerial change after about halfway point in the season. If you're in a relegation scenario, it's basically a toss of the coin about whether it works or not. So that's the stats. It's a 50-50 chance. On 50% of occasions, the manager changes things in the way it did for Unai Emery. And I think, Unai Emery is a manager that we couldn't afford or secure. But proved to be an excellent choice. But there are equally as many teams who make the managerial change then don't succeed.
But it's not a flip of a coin going into the World Cup break, is it? When you know you've got another clear window to do another pre-season, surely the change should be made. And I appreciate we're speaking with the aid of hindsight. Of course, I acknowledge.
Obviously, the decision, the decision was. I can't hide it or defend it. It was wrong. Based on where we ended up, it was the wrong decision because we got relegated, and that's what everybody was trying to avoid. And it was debated a lot at the time. And I thought, I don't know how many wins we had at that stage. Whether we had four or five wins at just before the halfway point of the season, maybe it was 4, and you need 9 wins to stay up. I think by that stage we knew that we were in a fight, we're in a scrap, so it was going to be difficult to turn things around with the managerial candidates available to be challenging in mid-table, and there was a decision about whether Jesse was better than the alternatives at keeping the club up. But you're completely right. If we had the decision again, knowing what we know now, we'd have absolutely made the change then. And it was a good opportunity. We can't deny the fact it was a very good opportunity to make the change because of that window. And I think we were, not fooled, but we were led by the 2 good results going into that, to feeling that you need 9 wins to stay up. And we felt that we were halfway there, and getting 2 back to back something that that we should be able to replicate in the second half of the season.
Within the boardroom at that stage, are you all coming to an agreement on this, or is it the case that some of you are still thinking there should be a change? Others are arguing, no, we've turned a corner here. This is going to see us through the season.
Yeah, I mean, without going into the individuals involved, there wasn't alignment in the board at that stage. There's a lot of opinions, and you've got to remember that we watch it through the same lens that all the supporters do. So most of what supporters say is a lot of the time you'd agree with the performances weren't good enough. But when you have to look at what's the type of change you can make, what type of manager can you get in, what are the chances of that manager making it better over that period? You have to take all those things into account. But as I said, again, clearly the wrong decision, and a change would have been better at that point.
The way you explain it there, though, it feels like Leeds United seem to make that excessively hard compared to other teams. And obviously, I'm going to be drawing on the examples of the teams that did stay up as opposed to the ones that didn't, who might have made changes. But there's an expectation that we should be, within the fans, I guess, conducting ourselves at a certain level. And it feels like we've always made those sorts of decisions very, very difficult or laboured. And, we could all see it spiralling out of control. I mean, just to go back to the recruitment, if I could. You mentioned the recruitment. I mean, you recruited 50 or 60 million quid's worth of players from Red Bull for Jesse. Was there was that part of the thinking where we've kind of got to see this through now because we've recruited the players for him?
Well, I think there was, one of the things when you make a change mid-season is even when you have the international break and you've got a number of players away and it's not a proper pre-season, is whether a new coach can come in and have that impact over 5 to 6 months. And obviously, we'd vested heavily in Jesse, in terms of his backroom staff, in terms of him, in terms of the players that we'd recruited. We felt that those players were, as I think Tyler Adams proved, were players who were good enough to play under any manager. But ultimately, I think if you look at the recruitment of those 5 or 6 players, they were all probably ended up being 5 out of 10s, and they needed to be 7 out of 10s. And if you lose your 2 best players and recruit a number of players that are only 5 out of 10s, then you give yourself a problem.
About the backroom staff as well, you mentioned it there. Was that ever strong enough in your opinion? I think there were concerns among the fans that it took a long time to bring in coaches to work with Jesse, and did that set us back?
Yeah, I think it was one of the learnings. I think Jesse struggled to pull the backroom staff together in the way that I think would have been ideal, and it was a direct contrast to the process we ran this summer, where the one of the sort of non-negotiables for us was that whoever we recruited came with a full backroom setup, or not a full backroom setup, but the top end of a backroom setup, a coaching team that they trusted, had worked with before. And interestingly, when we had an interview with Daniel before we even got to that point, he said exactly the same thing. He said that he came with his backroom staff, and it was non-negotiable that we were hiring a team, not an individual. And I think that was it replicated how Marcelo had operated as well. You don't just hire Marcelo, you hire his backroom team, and I think that was a good learning going forward. Obviously, when we had the interviews with Jesse, he had names and ideas of people he wanted to bring, but bringing that team together was harder than he thought. And I think what we've done with Daniel is much better. That he came with his 3 key lieutenants, and then brought in Ed as a goalkeeping coach to sort of complete a team. And he's got a team who've they've worked together for 5 or 6 years, and I think that that's definitely going to bring some benefit this season.
You mentioned before the technical aspects of what Jesse Marsh said he was bringing into the club. Did you find that those things in reality didn't materialise when you looked at the football?
Yeah, I don't. I mean, I think Jesse would say they didn't materialise. I mean, that would be.
And can I ask what they were? That
would be his. I mean,
you said the pressing stats.
I think he felt that what his vision was that the press would be more intense, and that when the ball was won, it'd be won in areas which were more dangerous for the opposition, and then he would have players who'd have the guile to convert winning the ball in those higher areas into goals. And bar a couple of games, I don't think we saw that.
I guess when you come in from a league where you have the highest budget and the standard is lower, it can work. But then it was underestimated, I guess, both by him and by Victor Orta in choosing him as thinking that would just translate easily.
I think one of the challenges for recruitment of managers, but also recruitment for players, and it's a lot of the data work that we've been doing this summer is trying to understand the ease of transition from somebody coming from a lower league into a higher league, or from a different international league into another league. And we know that the Premier League is a different standard to every single other league that exists. And one of the things we put as a recruitment criteria when we were hiring Daniel is they had to be managing in a top 4 league in Europe, and also Daniel managed in the Premier League as well. But we wanted somebody who'd managed both in the top 4 league and in the Premier League, because that transition risk is significant. And I think it's something we touched upon in our last conversation. But I think if I was to be critical of the sort of overarching approach that we took, I think there was a desire from all of the board, but particularly from Andrea, because he's was an ambitious guy, was that we wanted to really put Leeds on a very steep trajectory into Europe, and to do that on the budgets we had to take I think bigger risks in terms of the players that we recruited and the manager that we recruited, and trying to find somebody that would maybe overperform. If I could have the time again, I would have taken and this is through hindsight, I'd have taken a more kind of pragmatic approach, and talked about and come up with I think a managerial hire and playing hires which really secured Premier League status over a longer period, rather than having one good season and then struggling for a couple. I mean, people we talk a lot about the Brighton model, and obviously in fact a few years ago we were talking about the Leicester model, and you can see how that turned out. We're now talking about the Brighton model, and Brighton are a fantastically well-run club, and I've got huge admiration for Tony as an owner, and Paul Barber as a CEO, who just is a fantastic football administrator. But if you look at the first 4 years, so there's a few things to think about Brighton. The first thing is their ownership. They've had 14 years of ownership. So it's taken them 14 years to get to the point now where I think you could say they're probably one of the best run clubs in Europe. But their first 4 seasons in the Premier League, I think they finished 17th, 15th, 16th and 15th. So it wasn't an immediate transformation into a team which was going to take on the big 6. It was year after year of just scraping safety. And I think if I'd had the time again, I think we just needed to be a bit more pragmatic, a bit more conservative, and probably hire a manager and a coaching team and players who gave you more of a guarantee, perhaps less of an upside of finishing higher up the league, but more of a guarantee of retaining your Premier League status, which then provides you for a platform to grow, over a longer period.
We did get the steep trajectory on the plus side. It felt a little bit like Bielsa basically ran Leeds United. I was listening back to the old interviews. He had more or less his hand on every single part of it. It felt like when he left, probably there was a bit of a void there, and maybe some of Victor's ideas came to the fore, and then Marsh came in and some of his ideas came, and essentially their ideas were not as good. And when you saw we saw Leeds United, fancy Bielsa, pre-Leeds United Bielsa, and post-Leeds United, post-Bielsa Leeds United, and they look kind of similar in the way that they're disjointed and the players that have been bought don't fit. And it was just a window in the middle where he made them fit. So I think that's where a lot of the grief for the board comes from, is because people see the before, the after, and they reach the conclusion that, well, it was all Bielsa, and without him, nothing worked.
Yeah, and I can understand that. I mean, I think it's I've been in a club which was in a similar position with Arsene Wenger, and Manchester United have the same. When you have somebody who is so iconic and does run the club, and one of the things we also liked about Daniel was Daniel when we were negotiating the contract, didn't want to be called head coach. He said, "I'm not head coach, I'm first team manager." And although that's only a sort of semantic change in terms of job title, it actually sums up his approach, which is much more like Marcelo's, which is, I want to run everything. Daniel is not going to report into a director of football. Daniel Falk is going to run the football department with this, with the assistance of a technical director and head of recruitment and head of football operations. And we can, we've done a lot to restructure the football department over the summer. To give us more breadth of expertise in those areas, and I think we've done a good job there. But I think you're right. trying to transition from somebody who has defined the club and been so influential and and led the turning of a massive ship round from sort of 16 years of decline to such success is always going to be really challenging. And I understand, because of the fans' affection. I understand the fans are always going to. He will always be, quite rightly, their hero, and no one's ever going. And the board are always going to have to take responsibility when we're not successful. But I also think, Marcelo would say that that the board were, hugely supportive of him. We created an environment where he was able to work. The recruitment for him over that period was excellent. I think, Victor, has his critics, but I think that team with Alioski and Klitsch and Harrison and Ben White and Ilan Meslier, and all the people who helped get us promoted and helped get us to ninth in the league, there was a collective behind Marcelo. I think all of the guys, particularly the guys who worked up at Thorpe Arch, the medical team and the fitness coaches, and they created a wonderful environment around him. But I would never diminish the influence that he had. And from a personal perspective, often sort of I think people seem to see that there was some kind of tension between him and the board. But from a personal perspective, it was it will always be the greatest days of my career. You know this. I used to sit in meetings with him and have imposter syndrome that I was sitting and listening for 3 hours being lectured to by a football genius. It was a wonderful experience, inside the club and outside the club. The
problem is, though, he said, back me or replace me, and neither happened. And I'm not suggesting for 1 second it would have been the right thing to replace him having finished ninth, and I guess that's where the problem arises. But he did flag that up at the time, and it feels like the club didn't listen. You thought there was a third way.
No, I think it was his definition of, and it wasn't a tense conversation. It was what he meant by back him. Was he said we need to replace the whole squad, and we weren't in a position to be able to do that with the calibre of players that he wanted, and that was the reality of the ownership at the time. So it wasn't back me in, I need a couple more players. It was he'd always said, this has my methods have a 2-year timeline. Players will emotionally and physically will struggle with that, and that's why I think in one of the interviews I sort of said that we felt there was a timeline to it, and it was. I think I offended some people by suggesting that he was a sort of dead man walking. He wasn't. He was the one who had always said that his methods needed to be refreshed and renewed, and the way he suggested that was done by was by a huge squad overhaul. That a club which has only just been promoted and isn't backed by wasn't backed by the type of funding that some other clubs are backed by, we didn't have the capability to do.
Is that a failure of ownership, you think? At that point, that the owner then says, well, okay, I don't have the means to take this on to the next level. I've got one of the as you say, one of the geniuses of world football telling me this is what needs to happen. This is how you kick on to the next level. It felt like, based on what you were saying about the aggressive trajectory to try and get into Europe quickly, it was almost trying to game the system. It might have even been delusional when you've got Marcelo Bielsa there saying to you, look, we need to overhaul the squad and we do it this way. And,
I mean, I think, if there is... there's lots of ways you can criticise Andrea, but fundamentally, and I think he would hold his hands up to this. Is he didn't have he invested incredibly generously in the squad over his 6 years. Took huge risks, including hiring Marcelo who was on no other club in the Championship would have hired Marcelo based on not on terms of the individual, but in terms of his financial requirements. It was a really bold move by Andrea, but Andrea doesn't have the wealth to compete in the Premier League. Right. Just doesn't as an individual. And if you look at that, I mean, even in Brighton, I think to go back to them, I think Brighton certainly in 2022, they owed Tony Bloom £400 million. Mm-hmm. That's the level that you have to invest to finish 15th, 16th and 17th 4 years running. Mm-hmm. So I don't know whether you can criticise a guy for not being rich enough, but I would have said about Andrea...
I mean, football fans do that. It's just the nature of it, isn't it?
Of course they do. But I would say Andrea probably put at risk more of his personal net worth than any other owner in the Premier League. Mm-hmm. Now, that's not enough to be competitive, but and I think if we were in a different world, if we perhaps had the 49ers funding and full ownership at that stage, maybe there'd have been a different direction with Marcelo, and we could have supported him in the way we supported him. But I think what's important to recognise is this wasn't I need 30 million or I need 40 million. This was, I need an overhaul of players, and the players he wanted were 40 and 50 million pound players. And of course he wanted 40 and 50 million pound players because that's what you need to be successful. He loved Ben White. Ben White is a 55 million pound player. He loved Calvin Phillips. Calvin Phillips is a 50 million pound player. So that's, to really compete at that level, that's the type of purchase you need to be able to make. And I think as well, it's particularly challenging, when the team had just got promoted, because the reason why teams go down is because because managing that squad churn and managing a team that were very good in the Championship and maybe can have one good year in the Premier League. I think Sheffield United, when they went up, had one good year before they went they went down again. Is you have to manage that churn really aggressively, and how you manage it is difficult. And you get players like who've been fantastic servants for the club, and you have someone like Pablo who felt like at the time he almost got single-handedly got us promoted, and they are very difficult to accept that they need to move on, and how you replace them. And you come to someone like like Clicky who couldn't play 40 games a year for 3 years in a row like he did for the long term. And I think managing that churn's difficult. And Marcelo was right to take us to the next level. We needed a completely different level of funding.
I think where Andrea's ownership comes into it is that it felt like even in the summer before he chose to leave, it felt like the 49ers were there and there was maybe a deal to be done, but it felt like he was hanging on, whether or not for financial reasons or for just personal relevance, I suppose. I know there's the Ken Bates thing about an ex-chairman being a nobody, like whether or not he felt like he wanted to do more when actually there was no real way of doing it on the money he had.
I think, very, very clear Andrea was, Andrea sold reluctantly in the end. He loved his association with Leeds United for all sorts of reasons. So, is there a criticism that he could have, sold earlier? Potentially. And I think one of the biggest decisions for a custodian is when to know that you've taken the club as far as you could. And again, in hindsight, maybe if he'd have sold when we stayed up on the last day at Brentford, his legacy would have been made kept intact. It'd have certainly been a better financial decision for him to do it at that point. But I think the reason why owners are prepared to put millions of pounds of their own money into clubs is it's not for financial reasons, it's for emotional reasons. And if they're buying it for emotional reasons, then I think you have to accept that they might not be completely rational when they sell it.
You mentioned Brentford there and talking about managing squad churn and staying up and sustaining yourself in the Premier League. Why can they do it on much smaller revenues?
I mean, Brentford Brentford and Brighton have moved into a position where they both have a fantastic model. I don't think it's any coincidence that their ownership are both come from the same industry. Both have what I think is generally regarded in across all of football as a data-based advantage, both in terms of their selection of players, but also what we call their game model as well, which is statistically understanding the decisions that you need to make in games to maximise your chances of success. And I think they are the envy of world football at the moment in terms of how both those clubs have run, but they come from a very specific background. We think going forward that creating a competitive advantage in data analytics is going to be essential to any club's success. There's a lot of talk about how data is used. I think a lot of it is used completely suboptimally. There is more and more data available in terms of player tracking, in terms of player analytics, but how it is analysed, I think, is generally quite weak. And the 49ers have already put a significant investment in that area. And I think when you look at in 10 years' time, the top clubs in European football will be clubs who have mastered data analytics. And if you look at Man City or Liverpool, you'll see they are recruiting, data scientists from NASA and Google to come in and run those departments for them. And the reality is, in the Championship, we didn't have that. We didn't have that capability. I think Brighton and Brentford have it because of their kind of gambling, heritage, and it's being transferred brilliantly by the ownership. And that's an area we need to get better at.
Was our data analysis good enough when it came to the recruitment of Jesse Marsch and the players?
No, I don't. I mean, I think our data analysis is probably standard for the industry, but it's not a competitive advantage. And I think in both of in both the player recruitment, and you've got to remember on and I think this is when you speak to Brighton about how they do it, although data plays an important part, they also have They also do a lot of sort of softer profiling around the character of players, around emotional intelligence, around their fit in the squad, and you can identify players who fit really well from a data perspective, and then they're still unsuccessful. And if you look at transfers in the marketplace, you've got teams like Manchester United and Arsenal spending tens of millions of pounds on transfers of players who fail significantly. So data is not the kind of silver bullet at the moment to get those things right.
So just returning to the timeline, then we've gone from Jesse Marsch via a long and winding route there, but Javi Gracia comes in, and can you just talk us through that period at the club? Why Javi was brought in, and why he was let go before the end of the season? I
mean, at the time we were, and it was no secret that we were looking for somebody for a project to save our Premier League status at that stage. It was not a long-term hire. Whereas I think with Jesse, it had been someone Victor had tracked for a long while, and he thought he could manage the club for a number of years, not just save us from relegation. Javi came in with a specific job to do. We thought he had a good sense of what needed to change in the team. We thought that he was going to be pragmatic and get the results that were needed. It started reasonably well, and we thought he would have been able to do the job and was going to correct some of the kind of more glaring errors that I think the supporter base was seeing, that we saw from a kind of maybe a tactical or performance perspective. By the end, I think the performance at Bournemouth from an ownership perspective, felt so far below the standard that was required to keep us up at the over the last 4 games, that he was let go because we just felt that he'd lost the dressing room, and we needed one last throw of the dice with somebody who might, not from a tactical perspective, but just from a sort of leadership perspective, really by that stage we were in kind of miracle territory.
To go back to the appointment of him in the first place, when we were replacing Bielsa with Marsch, there was a lot of talk about how Victor Orta is always looking at the next step anyway, and there's a list of people, and he's always talking to people in the background. Whereas when we came to get rid of Marsch, it felt very much like we did that, and then we're going blindly into the market, because it was very. And when we got Gracia, he was very clearly not the first choice. We'd gone after. There was talk of Iraola, of Slot. Then Alfred Schroeder was at games, looking obviously on the verge of being appointed, and then in the end we get Gracia. So how did we go from being so prepared for the departure of Bielsa to having seemingly no idea what came after Marsch?
So the process was the same. So the people identified at that stage, should it be decided that Jesse shouldn't continue, were Iraola, Slot, and Raul. Raul had told us earlier in the season that he wasn't prepared to come to Leeds at that point. Iraola and Slot had both told us that they would prepared to come to Leeds and would be made available. And then when the process started, obviously happens quite quickly. Iraola decided that he wasn't prepared to come anymore, even though he had an exit clause. And Slot, I think, had misjudged the sort of vehemence of his club to keep him. And there's only so much you can do in terms of those conversations about you can't sign a manager before you. So those conversations were good. They were warm. We thought that both of those would have been candidates, and so Javi was definitely further down the list. And I think both of those candidates had a greater pedigree than Javi, and could have been longer term hires. And I think the fact that Iraola has ultimately found a Premier League job suggests that we weren't the only people to think that he was an appropriate candidate.
I think that it adds to the feeling that things completely slipped away from us, though, to go into that thinking we can get one of the hottest prospects of European coaching in Slot or Iraola, to then end up with with the greatest respect to him, an ex-Watford manager, and I know there are lots of those, and then to end the season just with the man that you get in to try and salvage things in Sam Allardyce, it felt like the project completely transformed within the space of a few months.
Yeah, that's what I was getting at when I said about spiralling out of control.
Well, I think there is a strategic decision about whether you're prepared to commit to a project for in the long term and not change your manager and just say, look, this is a 4 to 5 year project. It's going to take some time. If we have to spend a season in the Championship, we'll spend a season in the Championship and then we'll come back up. Or there's another approach, which is, the project is important. We want to make long-term hires. We want to have a long-term manager. Nothing is, it's much, much better running a football club, where you've got a manager that everybody loves and is doing well, and there's no threat of him leaving. And we had that with Marcelo for 3 years. Or you make a decision that the Premier League status is absolutely critical to the future of the club, and we need to protect it at all costs. And if it seems like the long-term project is going to be is going to result in you losing your Premier League status, then you have to make another decision. And I think with the ownership position we're in, with the 49ers, knowing that they were coming in and the funding that they were going to bring, keeping Premier League status was of real importance, and knowing how difficult to get out of the Championship, and I think the board made the decision that we had to make a change, and I think also there was by that stage it was a bit easier because there was probably the belief in the club that despite Jesse being a great guy, he probably wasn't the right long-term solution there. It was significantly harder when we made the decision on Marcelo because we felt that we could still have a long-term project around him. But we also felt that it was going to be, compromised by a year in the Championship. And then, there's no hiding from the fact that when you come to the appointment of Sam Allardyce, that's nothing to do with the project at all. That's one final roll of the dice and getting someone in who's prepared to come in. And because when you get to that stage, and I think that's where Jesse has to take some credit. He had a very good managerial track record, and yet he was prepared to join Leeds in a situation where they were in significant jeopardy, and it could have been a real black mark on his career to get us relegated. So the closer you come to the end of the season, your market shrinks in terms of the calibre of people who are prepared to take the role.
It was also by far the biggest job Jesse Marsh had ever been offered, though, as well. I know he'd been successful elsewhere and was, I suppose, you would say on an upward trajectory until he got to the Bundesliga, but I mean, it was a very good job for him to take at that time.
I think that's the reason that he, that is part of the reason that he took it, and it was based on Victor's belief that he was going to be one of the highest performing coaches of the next 3 to 4 years. But certainly the fact that he wasn't already that played into the fact that he was willing to take the job.
Do you think, on reflection, it would have been better to just go for Allardyce at the point of getting rid of Marsh?
I think Sam would have probably been, because he is the ultimate pragmatist. I think he would have probably had it given us a better chance at that stage. But again, that's in hindsight. So,
just on Javi Gracia, how do we go from 21st of February? I think it was. He was appointed within 2 months. He's lost the dressing room when he went at the back end of April. Was the Bournemouth game, wasn't it? What does that say about the recruitment of him as a manager?
Well, I mean, I think one of the things that I think I've seen repeatedly with Leeds United, and it fed right back into, I think, one of the themes of what we're talking about today should be the lessons that we learned and how that's informed the Daniel Farke appointment. And one of the things is Leeds United just breaks managers. It's a really, really hard place to come and manage. You need to be a really special person to take it. And I think, as well as the kind of tactical complexities of the Premier League, I think one of the things that Jesse found challenging and would admit to found challenging was it's just a massive club to manage. You're living in a city where everybody is obsessed with the results. You can't go anywhere or do anything. The media are all over you. There's pressure on the players. Ellen Road's a really, really difficult place to play in when things are not going well. And ultimately, you need managers who've got broad enough shoulders to take that. And when I think again in a previous interview, and again I think I was taken out of context, but I talked about Marcelo being bigger than the club. It's a good thing. He was bigger than in his mind. he wasn't going to compromise his principles for what the press were saying or what the fans were saying, or wasn't. He was prepared to sit through games at Ellen Road where we're playing it across the back four and looking like we're going to lose it, and all the crowd are gasping in all the way through, and he's got the commitment to say we're going to play through this. And I think lots of managers and players get caught out with not caught out, but they get exposed by the scale of the club that they're joining, and I think that that's something that I think both Jesse found and Javi found, that when it's not going very well, Leeds is a really, really tough place to be a manager. Winning games helps though, doesn't it? So if you put managers in who can win games, that will help everybody. I mean, managers who win games is that's the solution to everything. So I can't disagree with you on that. You should try doing that more often. That is on the list. And I mean that feeds in exactly into Daniel Farke. Daniel Farke is a manager who is who is proven at this level, who is supremely confident at this level, who came in his interview and didn't really talk about the Championship at all, talked about how he thinks he deserves a Premier League opportunity and how Leeds United is the perfect vehicle to prove himself in the Premier League. He's got the ability to go into a dressing room after we have drawn our first 3 games at home and 3 matches that we probably should have won, and sit down to the team and say to them, I had less points at this point the last time I won this league, and I ended up with 102 points. So don't worry, guys, we're going to be fine. And the dressing room relaxes, and everyone feels good about it. He's got the credibility to go and speak to the fan base and give them the confidence that he's got this. And he feels like a man who has got the situation. And we have been through a really, I'm sure we'll come to it, but we've been through a really challenging transfer window where lots of managers would have lost their shit repeatedly. He has been, so calm, so collaborative, so focused, and so confident in that he's leading us in the right direction. I think it's exactly what a club the size of Leeds United needs.
We can get into that if you like, the transfer window, but I think we've probably got to start with recruitment and the clauses and the job that Victor Orta's done as well. And I know you work closely with Victor Orta, so you might not necessarily want to chuck him under the bus, but there's a lot of Leeds fans feel like doing so. Really, really unhappy with the recruitment. Do you accept that sort of overall, by and large, it's just not been good enough?
I think it fits into 2 phases. I think the recruitment around Marcelo and the season that we went up and the season we finished 9th was great. I think we found some great players. I think even in the team that we've got at the moment, we've got Willy Gnonto that we paid next to nothing for. We've got Ilan Meslier that we paid next to nothing for. We've got Somerville that we paid next to nothing for, and Pascal Stroit that we paid next to nothing for. All of whom are £20 million players, and we received offers of that level. So I think like most clubs, it's been a mixed bag. But I think in the last window, everybody would hold their hands up, and we look at these things collectively. It's managers are involved, board are involved, Victor's involved, the scouts are involved, the medical team are involved. It clearly didn't work, and it wasn't good enough, and that's one of the problems that we're faced with in this window. And I know the exit clauses have frustrated people, but the reality is, if the players had performed in line with their expectation and in line with the values that we'd have paid for them, well, 2 things would happen. 1, we probably wouldn't have gone down, and 2, they'd have been sold for their exit clauses in the same way that Tyler Adams was, because he retained his value because he had a reasonably good season. The fact that the others aren't reaching the value of their exit clauses show that season hasn't worked. And I think when I look at it strategically, I think it is probably the mistake was probably trying to find players who had the potential to be 8 out of 10s or 9 out of 10s, but maybe were too high risk, when perhaps we should have had a strategy. And I think we should have had a strategy where we were hiring 6 to 7s out of 10s that keep you up, which is something that maybe a team like Crystal Palace do, who perhaps are being more pragmatic about what their ambitions are, and have therefore retained their Premier League status for 10 years because they've recruited along those lines.
I mean, there's always the sense of, like, Victor's broken toys is a phrase I've often used on the show before. It always felt like that they were going for the sort of moonshot signings. Why not just do the obvious thing sometimes? It was something that fans, and I know we did on the show, plead for it over and over again.
Well, and again, I mean, there was and a lot of those occasions, I think it worked, and there've been some successes there, but there've also been some failures. And I think in a window that we lost Rafinha and Calvin, who were sort of so critical to securing results in that season, the signings that we made didn't compensate for them, and I think we could have made, in retrospect, we could have made perhaps more pragmatic signings which didn't have the upside. But again, the key thing for me is that we learn from that, and we've taken that forward into this transfer window, where I'd like to think that supporters would see there's been been a different approach, and there has been a more pragmatic, perhaps more obvious approach to the signings, but perhaps a clearer strategy, and hopefully one which will deliver.
To go back to the interview last summer, there was talk about, because obviously Rafinha had just left, saying how this was actually a good thing from a Leeds point of view, because players see Leeds United as a stepping stone and almost as a way to move on to other clubs. And I know there's a slightly grim acceptance of that amongst the fan base, even, that you get someone who does well. But it seems like when it doesn't work, clearly you have the thing now of players who we've had nothing from, who would just now want out anyway, is what we've essentially been left with this summer. And I know there was, in the past, there's been talk about assessing the values of players on like a personal level and getting the right fit personality-wise and stuff. It feels like that's broken down catastrophically as well, because as soon as we came down, there were clearly a number of them who had absolutely no interest in staying in the Championship and had moves lined up for a period of time, which presumably were being lined up as we were getting relegated from the Premier League. So that as a whole, I feel has just not worked at all. The idea of being a stepping stone has maybe led to the idea that people think, well, it's a temporary thing. It's a temporary thing. Is Leeds United, one way or another? I'm out of here soon.
So I think you're right in terms of the what the players, the players' desire to leave, and I can talk about that. I'm not sure you're right in terms of the reason why that's caused. I think what I've seen is, and I kind of believe the players when I've spoken to them, the vehemence and that they don't want to play in the Championship has absolutely surprised me. And I don't think it's a Leeds United thing. I think it is a broader football thing. It's about the profile of the Premier League. It's about the money paid in the Premier League, particularly for international players. It's about how they feel about the Championship. And if you look at Tier 2 leagues across Europe, they're universally rubbish. I mean, I think the Championship is the 5th biggest league in Europe, against after the Bundesliga and Serie A and Liga. And so I think, as somebody who's grown up here, I think the Championship's I don't want to be in it. I prefer to be in the Premier League, but I think it's a fantastic league, and I think it's better than it'd be better than playing in Ligue 1 in France. What we've seen is that players have absolutely no desire to play in it, and we thought we would have more of an ability to convince them, more of an ability to convince them that this was a great project, and that playing in the Championship and tearing it up for a season would be good for them, would be good for their careers, wouldn't harm their international careers. And I have to say, I kind of feel that I've been maybe naive about it, but it's been just brutally disappointing at how we've seen players want to crawl over broken glass to leave our club. It's because you guys know. I mean, I love the club, and I know we've had a bad year, but I thought there would be, for a number of these players, there'd be a bigger emotional bond, and there'd be a desire to sort of put right bad seasons that they had last year. But I don't think that's necessarily to do with how Leeds United is positioned for them, and I don't think any of the players saw Leeds United as a stepping stone to go and play for Mönchengladbach or Union Berlin, or I think it is just a function of how they perceive the Championship. And actually, if you look at the two teams that went down, Southampton and Leicester, there is almost an identical picture of the number of players who've left and the number of players who they brought in. So I think we've all brought about 9 or 10 players in, and about 10 to 13 players have left each of those clubs. So I think it's more of an issue of people's lack of desire to play in the Championship. And I have to, I would confess, we definitely underestimated the strength of that feeling.
But I think people do look at Leicester and Southampton, look at some of the fees coming into those clubs, and it's a very different picture to the one we have had, which is just people leaving on loan.
And I think if you look, if you look at that, particularly for Leicester, it's around the fact that their players have been in the league for longer. And so, I think people have been able to forgive Maddison. I know they didn't get FIFA Tielemans, but Maddison, Tielemans and Barnes, they've been able to forgive them, one bad season or one below average season, because they've had 4 or 5 good seasons in the Premier League before that where they've proven their class. So they definitely deserve to generate the fees. Now, we could have had a very similar picture at Leeds United. So we accepted the offer for Tyler. We could have accepted an offer well in advance of that for Willie, significantly in advance of that. We could have taken an offer for Ilan, which would have been in the mid-20s, an offer for Sinistera, which would have been at 20, an offer for Pascal Struijk, which would have been low teens. So if we'd have been in a position where we'd have needed to cash in, we could have done. Equally, we could have taken offers on some of the players who left on loans, but we didn't take those offers because we wanted to not crystallise the P&S loss of them being sold below their book value. And so I've instead taken the salary saving. The salary saving we made across this season, because of the loans and because of the outs, is £40 million. And that £40 million has been directly reinvested into salaries of the new players and signing and transfer fees of the new players. So we could have had a much more financially kind of productive window if we'd wanted to, but we didn't want to because we wanted to retain those players that we talked about and we think will be key to us being successful.
Just looking at the difference between Leicester and Southampton and the approach that we've ended up taking, and you say the difference is in the players that they've been able to move on for big fees because they've been in the league for longer. Was the risk discussed of buying players who didn't have a track record in this country? Because you put them on inflated Premier League wages, and then when you get relegated, it means they're bloody hard to shift, basically.
Yeah, I mean, all of this, the whole premise is that these players are going to be able to deliver at the level. And although there were some risks in there, these players weren't out of nowhere. Most of them are seasoned internationals. Most of them were playing, have played at a reasonable level before. So when you look at Llorente, Koch, Tyler, Brendan, they are players that when we signed them, no one was saying they're Hail Marys. They were saying, okay, they look like, they're not solid, proven Premier League players, but they are players who we would all think would have the ability to contribute. And because, 4 or 5 of those players didn't in the way we wanted, I think, we were not helped by, we're not helped by injuries. I think Tyler was the best player, and if he'd have played all season, I think we'd be in a better position. I think if Rodrigo hadn't been injured at Accrington, he was scoring at a rate, I think, second only to Haaland in terms of minutes per games, and those are small things, the small margins which caused us not to be successful.
To go back to a few of the specific examples of players who've left, I look at Harrison and Verba, both of who've signed contracts in this year and have then been allowed to leave on loan. Now, I know you say you've been kind of shocked that players are not willing to stay around, but you can't really be shocked by it when people are inserting loan exit clauses into contracts, surely. Because
what did you expect would happen?
Because that is clearly their agents or the players going, well, I need a way out of this, and I don't see myself as playing in that league.
Well, they all want the way out because they don't want to take the salary cut. So we have a choice when we structure someone's contract about whether we wanted to have a salary cut or not. And the salary reductions that we had were somewhere between 40 and 60%. So they're very aggressive. They're some of the most aggressive in the Premier League. And that was done because we wanted to run the club prudently, because we knew we couldn't carry the weight of a Premier League wage bill in the Championship because we didn't have the funding for it. It's because we were still new to the league, and so the prospect of going down was still fairly realistic. So I imagine when Leicester are signing players, they don't have to have relegation clauses in because no one thought Leicester were going to get relegated. Even Southampton, who'd been in the league for 10 years, probably didn't have to have those measures. But we did because the owners couldn't, Andrea couldn't fund a Premier League wage bill in the league below. But just because they put those clauses in, I mean, there's 2 things. One is that we thought that in a lot of cases they would trigger their release clause, which is a transfer fee, because you'd like to think that the majority of players at least retained their value. In the case of the ones we recruited, they didn't, and many of them were significantly below their value. And then the second one is, when it comes to the loan, there is a conversation to be had, and obviously they want the protection of the loan. They don't know what the ownership picture is going to be. They don't know who you're going to hire as a manager. They don't know whether you're going to invest in the squad. We thought at that point, and and for some of them it's worked. The position of the 49ers taking over, hiring the most successful manager in recent years, evidencing that we were going to reinvest in the squad, evidencing that we were going to be aggressive in keeping players that we could keep, like Somerville and Willie, showing that we were going to go out and buy a top championship centre forward, whether that was going to be Cameron Archer or Joel Perreault. We thought that those things would have influenced people, and particularly when you looked at the loan options that were available to them. And from my perspective, going on loan to Everton in the predicament that Everton are in versus staying and having another season at Leeds and getting them promoted, I think there's a valid choice for a player to make there, and as I said, I think we were surprised. But the reality is at the time, to secure Jack Harrison on a new contract, to ensure that he took the wage reduction if we went down, those were the types of things that were in place. If we'd have had the 49ers as sole owners at that point, would we have had to be aggressive in the wage cuts? I don't think we would have done, because I think they'd have had the funding to be able to to cushion the blow into the Championship.
I suppose to flip it around though, and if you're on the buying side, you can completely see why, if there is a loan and a buy clause there, you take the loan, because there's no risk there for you. If you're looking at getting Harrison on loan for a year, or Sinisterra, you can think, well, there's not a huge financial commitment here. We don't have to book a massive value against this.
Get injured, we send them back.
Exactly. It feels like in offering a loan and a buyout, it's only in very rare number of cases of obvious extreme proven talent that someone is going to take the buyout.
It's the path of least resistance, isn't it?
Exactly, because you can take an almost risk-free gamble on someone like Jack Harrison, because you can say, well, if all we're doing is covering his wages for a year, absolutely fine.
And that's why the players want them. So you go into that knowing that. But what ultimately you're expecting is ultimately players would prefer to go on permanence. They don't want to go. And the players who've gone on loan are in difficult position. They're in a difficult position now in terms of where they are, whether the team goes up, whether the team goes down, whether they want them permanently, the fact they've got to move back. I think that the difference was that the players had performed so below their expectations. They were just so far from getting permanent offers. But out of the players that we've lost, and I think Daniel would agree with this, the majority aren't regretted losses for the project that we want going forward. Some of them are, and we'd have loved to keep Jack Harrison. And Jack Harrison was, a number of players were made offers which would have closed the financial gap for them between where they were and where they are now. And they still decided they just wanted to be in the Premier League. And at some point, and this is where we got to with Sinisterra, you have to make a decision around, if a player is to go to such extremes to leave the club, how much do you want him? I mean, one thing we do know about Leeds United, we've learned over the last 6 years, is Leeds United can't carry passengers. Supporters won't let it carry passengers. Daniel Farke won't let it carry passengers. And we had to make a decision around, we can try really, really hard to keep somebody, but at some point you have to say, if the player doesn't want to be here that much, then perhaps they're not right for this project.
Just on the loan clauses, Daniel Farke himself has spoken out against them and the lack of control it's given us in the market. Did he say they were he can't think of another club in Western Europe that's done the same sort of thing? Fans have been very, very put out by them as a concept. Are they wrong to think that?
Well, I think if I look at where we've ended up, I think we've probably lost 2 to 3 players that we wouldn't have wanted to lose. We've saved £40 million in wages, and we brought 9 players in, or 10 players in, who really, really want to be here and really want to play for Leeds United, and I don't think are a significant downgrade in any of those things. I've spoken to Daniel at length of this. I know he's frustrated about it. I'm frustrated about it. He knew about it when we came into it, so he had full visibility of it. But of course it's frustrating, because right till the last moment, we have a player like Luis who we want to keep. But ultimately, Lewis was prepared to do anything to leave, and then we had to accept that. And what we needed to make sure was that we brought in a player who really wanted to be here, and we think can be at least an adequate replacement, and if you take his availability into account, potentially a better replacement. But I can totally understand the frustration. But I think the alternative would have been we'd have been forced into selling players below their book value, who absolutely desperately wanted to get away. So we have an element of control in terms of, from a P&S perspective, but fully understand the fans' frustrations, and no one's been more frustrated than me about this.
Do you take responsibility for those clauses as a whole?
Well, I mean, it's they're a board decision. They're done based on the financial reality of the club. So, we had a position of, well, do we sign players that do we sign players that are unwilling to accept a reduction in their relegation in their championship salary? And if they are, what type of position does that put us in if we go down and you're ending up paying Diego Llorente £6 million a year? But it's linked into the broader, the macro funding of the club and the position that you're in if you're relegated.
Because Parag did a thing on the official podcast with Matt Lewis in which he said he negotiates contracts in his sleep, and I think fans would probably benefit from knowing whether the 49ers Enterprises Group have had any input into contracts up to this point, because it's a grey area. People are not sure. And you stack up what's happened with the contracts and the loan clauses, with Parag saying that. A bit of clarity, I suppose, would go a long way around this. The key driver behind player negotiations was definitely the majority shareholder. But the 49ers absolutely had visibility, about it, and they're frustrated as well. But we're entering into a position where we have a different funding structure now, and those loan clauses wouldn't have been so important if the 49ers had full ownership. Would you have preferred to keep Adams and Sinisterra?
No.
On what basis?
On their desire to leave.
Okay. And how vehement were they then that they had to leave, and to what extent, to what extremes have they gone then? Because you've sort of hinted towards that. So I respect all players' desire to play at the highest level. They have short careers, and they should have the opportunity, should they want to play at the highest level. And to be fair to them, when they bought into the Leeds United project, one of our sales. One of the things that we sell to players is, you're joining a Premier League team who is on a trajectory where we're going to grow into the Premier League, and we're going to be consistent Premier League performers. They didn't want to join they didn't join a Championship side. However, I think there are ways that you can handle your desire to play at the highest level, and from a personal perspective, I don't think either of those two players handle it particularly well. In what way? Can you expand on that, or?
I just think I think you can voice your desire to leave. I think the first thing is you need to be professional in the interim is the first thing. You need to remember who you're contracted to and the value of that, the value of that contract. And I think you need to use, you need to approach that through discussion and trying to get to mutual agreement rather than the avenues that they pursued.
Can you expand on what they were, or is that too much?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's particularly particularly helpful to expand on what they are. And as I said, I kind of ultimately have to respect their decisions, but there's I don't think it's a way to behave to a club that's really looked after you and continues to look after you and was offering you I think fantastic alternatives to remain at the club.
So were you looking at new contracts, incentives, so on and so forth, to try and make people stay?
Yeah,
right.
But I think in the end, I think there are players who had the discussions and did the right things and did them in a timely manner, and then I think there were players who were perhaps led by their agents to employ tactics which will mean they're not on our Christmas card lists.
With Sinisterra then, because obviously he is our player, he's due back next summer. And you said we received offers for him. Why did it go late in the window then? If presumably this wasn't something he thought of, 2 days before the window was going to close, that he'd like to leave. Why did it go as late as that, and why was he not sold as opposed to just going out on loan?
It's sold purely because we couldn't get to the value that we believed he's worth, and I think that's for his perspective, that was simply because he just hasn't played enough games. I think he's a player that is worth more than we paid for him, and I think ultimately he'll be a player that we'll sell for above his book value or above the amount we paid for him in time if the decision is to sell him. The nature of the timing of his departure was purely down to our position that we were refusing to let him go until we could find a replacement. And Jadon Anthony had been on our target list from right at the start of the window as a winger that we wanted if any of our wingers were to leave, and we presumed that maybe one of Jack or Willie or Luis would leave, but he seemed to be a central part of Bournemouth's plans and therefore wasn't available, and we'd kind of given up on him, and we'd given up on other targets. We were had lengthy discussions with Paintsel at Genk, which didn't come to fruition either, and then it all came together in the last day. And we ended up in a position where we were able to let him go because we were swapping a player who, in Jadon, who really wanted to be here, and I think was excited about joining Leeds and being at the heart of something really successful. And we lost a player who didn't want to be here at all.
Was your position watertight on Adams and Sinistera, do you feel? Because we've seen the difference with what's happened with Willie Gnonto, which is you've made him stay effectively and obey the terms of his contract, and rightly so.
There was, the avenues that Tyler and Lewis were exploring had some risk to the club. We were fairly solid in our position, but ultimately it was a combination of the legal position and their desire to leave. Whereas, I think unfairly on Willie, that's been the one that has been sort of blown out of proportion, because ultimately, I think Willie had a wobble around an offer that was received, and probably took some bad advice from his advisors briefly, and then it was resolved very, very quickly. And I think we see from Willie's performances, he's pleased to be here and he's committed, and I think he'll have a great season.
Did you achieve everything you set out to in the window, do you feel? Was it aggressive?
I think the problem with the I remember when Parag said aggressive, and you sort of it's open to interpretation. I think it was aggressive. One of the things which is difficult in the Championship, it's actually really difficult to spend any money, because the calibre of players that you may want to sign who are above the 10 million. I don't think there's many transfers in the Championship which are more than £10 million. I think there may be one or two, but I think the majority are way under 5 million. So the fact that we've got a number in above 5 million puts us, well at the top of the spenders, both kind of in, collectively and individually. So I think, whereas you're in the Premier League, if you're saying you're going to be aggressive, you can go and buy a £50 million player. The reality is that when you look at players that I think were on our target list, and we would be open about it, and we'd have liked to sign. So you take someone like Gustavo Hamer at Coventry, or Gyökeres at Coventry, or Cameron Archer at Aston Villa, who were players that we thought would be on the cusp of joining a lower level Premier League team or a good Championship side. I think we were very confident that we were confident, and I think we were proved right in our ability to fight off Leicester or Southampton. So I don't think Leicester or Southampton have signed anybody that ahead of us in terms of who we wanted. But where we have lost out is to Premier League sides, and it's depressing to, with the greatest respect to Bournemouth, it's depressing to lose players to Bournemouth or to Sheffield United. But the type, that type of player, take someone like Cameron Archer. He has already had, one. He's had a Championship loan, doesn't want to go again, wants a permanent home. We're prepared to offer him a permanent home, but would prefer to be in the Premier League. And you can make the case that I think that Leeds United probably have more chance to be in the Premier League more regularly over the next 5 years than Sheffield United do. But the fact we're not there at the moment is a problem for those players. So I think we were as aggressive as we could be, because the players. So I think Gyökeres went for 20, and Cameron Archer went for 17, and Hamer went for 14. But those are players who just aren't simply available to Championship clubs. So right. I think we've been aggressive on loans. I think we've used the loan market well, and I think with the quality that we've signed in terms of how much we've spent, we've been about as aggressive as we can be.
Is there a profit and sustainability pressure at all? Because that's one of the things that's one of those rumours that just keeps swirling around. Obviously, there's an imperative you have to abide by it, and it is a lot tighter in the EFL than it is in the Premier League. Are we under any direct pressure to make the numbers add up?
Yes, every club that comes down is under pressure. I fail to see how they can't be. When I went to the EFL conference at the start of the season, pretty much the first thing that the chairman said was that the problem with of competitiveness in the EFL is that out of the teams that go up, 2 will have parachute payments and 1 won't. And that's the standard position. So he said effectively there's 6 teams normally who've got parachute payments in the league. So he's effectively sort of saying, you've got a 1 in 18 chance of getting promoted, and that's wrong. And so the PNS rules or the FFP rules in the Championship are deliberately designed to squeeze the teams who've come down with parachute payments to make sure they can't pay their way out. And I think with the independent regulator on the horizon,
I know you're a fan.
Yeah, more power to the Conservative government. I think, and what can go wrong?
That will be clipped and taken out of context.
By the way, that's the thing. When people shout at me in the street, "Tory twat," I think we can have a healthy debate about twat. But I'm not a Tory. But I think there will be increasing pressure to level the competitive playing field in the Championship to make it harder for the teams that get relegated. They've talked about killing parachute payments in their entirety. So definitely that sort of vice of PNS is one that we have to be very mindful of. Fortunately, Leeds in the Championship has remarkable revenues. So even our revenues without parachute payments were 60 million. Whereas I think many teams in the Championship only have revenues of 15. So we have a competitive advantage that we need to take advantage that we need to capitalise on. We have the advantage of our parachute payments, but ultimately, if we were to remain in the Premier League, in the Championship for more than one season, we'd have to make outbound transfers to stay within the P&L limits.
And in the sort of medium term, I know we don't want to do that Leedsy thing of looking ahead and running before we can walk and all that. But is the financial status of the club now stronger than it was under the previous ownership? Because I think people are seeing the sort of this squeeze in the EFL and wondering about the new ownership. And it being this sort of nebulous venture capital backed operation, people automatically assume venture capital equals asset stripping, dividends, profits, things like that. Can you just give us a little bit of clarity on what the ownership looks like?
Yeah, I mean, there's not any requirement for the club to throw off cash to the owners in the short, medium, or even long term. I think the ownership understand that certainly in the Championship, but even in the Premier League, that's not the way to run a model. The 49ers' vision is to invest in the infrastructure. So that's the stadium, that's the training ground, that's the quality of the team and the facilities around it, to grow the enterprise value year on year rather than throw off cash. And what we do have is, we now have an ownership group with deeper pockets and a better ability to fund us, and I think that will evidence itself in the ability to kickstart the stadium project, so that when we do get back promoted, everything is in place to move that forward, more quickly. And I think when we get to back to the Premier League, it will evidence itself in our ability to be more aggressive, both in terms of the wage bill and the transfer fees. However, it is more challenging to show, to be financially aggressive in the Championship because the rules are there and they're tight.
I mean, on the basis that Premier League teams don't make profit, even though there is a huge amount of money sloshing around, what you're talking about then from an ownership point of view is essentially them growing their asset to a point where 5 years, 10 years down the line, they think it's worth £1 billion, £2 billion, £3 billion, something like that, and that's where they see the money in it, I guess, as opposed to what you may term like the Bates model, which is to take a bit here and there.
Yeah, I don't think there's any interest in that from the core of the ownership or any of the investors around it. It's about driving asset value, and I think the reason why you see such American interest in UK sports is that they look at the so Stan Kroenke, when I worked at Arsenal, Stan Kroenke, early on, he bought just 10%. And I think Stan owns the full suite of American sports franchises. So he's got the Rapids, the Avalanche, the Rams, the Nuggets. And he said when he went around the world, despite him being one of the most sort of storied franchise owners in American sport, all everybody wanted to talk to him about was his 10% stake, shareholding in Arsenal, and he was able to buy the entirety of Arsenal for, I think, less than he'd spent on his NBA team. So I think they see the ability for franchises, as they would call them, we would call them clubs, to be worth multiples of what they're worth now. And I think also, I've always thought, and it was one of the reasons I came to the club, was Leeds truly has the potential. I still think it's the most investable club in European football, because it's playing in the right league. If you're going to invest in a club, you really want it to be in the Premier League, but you need to give it some inherent competitive strengths, and we have that because we have the brand. We have the city. We have one club in the city. Whatever it is, the third or fourth biggest city in the country, and it only has one club. We sell 250,000 shirts is the same, which we sell in the UK, not internationally, is the same number as Tottenham and Arsenal sell domestically. I mean, it's fantastic fan base. Plus, you've got a stadium which is ripe for development, which has the room around it to do it, and a fan base that will be able to fill it, even if you went up to 60,000. So, if you're looking at it purely from which target should you invest in English football, I think the 49ers have picked the right one.
You talk about increasing asset value, because that will make football fans wince. They'll go, corporate speak. But what does that look like? What does that translate into a vision for Leeds fans? Because they're going to say, well, we've heard him say now that their plan is to grow us and then sell us, and people don't like that. It's not compatible, is it, with sporting emotion?
Well, it's interesting because the 49ers don't talk about that at all, and I think because they come from a sporting background, because ultimately it's family owned, and family own the 49ers. They talk a very similar language to we do, and I have no real interested long-term financial targets of that's not for me. What we talk about internally is we want to make people proud of supporting Leeds United. And the good thing is, if we can make people proud of supporting Leeds United and being part of Leeds United, then the financial benefits come with it, because it means you have to be winning games. It means you have to be doing the right stuff off the pitch. You need to be handling yourself properly. And I think, our biggest disappointment last year was that, we've gone from a period where people really felt, proud to be associated with the club and proud to be part of the club and proud of the city, to one where we weren't proud again, and that is the simple mission. There are no financial targets for Leeds United this year, other than we need to stay within P&S, and we need to make and then we just need to get everybody proud to be belonging to our club again.
If it goes well, we know it's going to be sort of spades in the ground as soon as possible. Start to develop the ground, which all sounds great. Leeds fans a bit worried because of last 20 years and so on. What if it goes badly? What happens?
From a ground development perspective,
or just generally,
or more generally. Yeah. Okay, so more generally, I think the thing that I've always felt about Leeds United, which has always given me confidence, is if Leeds United is well run, at the very minimum, it should be getting promoted from the Championship or being in the playoffs every season. And it is still, you guys know the history better than I do, but it's still a mystery to me that over 16 years it just couldn't get itself in that position, because based on its size, based on its commercial revenues, based on the fact it's a better place to attract people to, based on the fact of the strength of the academy and the quality of our training ground, we shouldn't be in a position. Leeds United shouldn't be in a position where clubs like Huddersfield and Luton Town and Oldham and all the clubs that have played in the Premier League and been promoted out of the Championship are getting promoted, and Leeds United aren't. So I think the worst case scenario is that if we weren't promoted this season, there would need to be a bit of a reset from a P&S perspective. But I still think we should, based on the financials of the club, we should still have a squad which is in the top four in terms of competitiveness in the league. And if you combine that with a good manager, which I think we have, and I think we've got a good manager for the long term. I mean, we've always talked to Daniel about it might take us 1, 2 or 3 years to get up, and he's bought into that. I feel that we've got a team that even in the worst case scenario should be challenging to get promoted.
Just to go back to the recruitment, actually, just because it's obviously the first season without Victor. How has that changed then, and how does the new structure fit anymore, and who does what exactly within it?
So I think what we've tried to do is what I think with the director of football role is quite a new role in football. So I hadn't worked with one at Arsenal or West Ham. It was the first time I'd been exposed to it at Leeds United, and I think, and this isn't a comment about Victor at all, but I think for anybody doing that role, the breadth of skills that that you need to deliver it properly are really challenging, because you have to do recruitment, so you have to have an eye for a player, you have to be able to understand data, you have to be able to understand scouting reports, you have to have a feel for whether a player can develop, play at the right level, how they're going to transition, and that normally involves that you've been in the game or been involved in the game at some reasonably good level. You then have to you have to head up player trading and player negotiations, which is a completely different skill set. It's a skill set which is about financials and being persuasive and understanding contracts and understanding terms and being able to contractual terms and being able to benchmark, getting the best financial offer, which is not necessarily a skill set which sits with someone who's really good at spotting who a great left winger is. Alongside that, you then have the whole operational piece and the whole football operation. So if you go up to Thorpe Arch, and there's 120 people reporting there, we've got a school which is teaching academy kids. We've got homes where kids are staying, in sort of with not foster parents, but the equivalent of foster parents,
local families, digs,
local
basically.
families. They're in digs.
Yeah.
All the child protection issues around that. We've got the grounds, the facilities, the electricity, the security, the food, the nutrition. That big operational piece. And then you've got this piece around football administration, which is around structuring the contracts properly, making sure that they're UEFA approved and FIFA approved and FA approved and EFL approved. And there's just a massive breadth of skills that are required to do those jobs. So in the restructure that we've done this summer, we've brought Greta in on the technical and recruitment front. We had Nick Hammond from a negotiation and player trading perspective. We had Adam Underwood, who has run one of the most successful academies in the country for many years, and stepping up, and he still has academy responsibility, but he now heads up football operations and how Thorpe Arch operates, and the facilities and player care, and team logistics and data analytics all sit within that. And then we have Hannah Cox, who's been here for 11 or 12 years, as head of football administration to kind of run the contractual side and the process side of things. So I think we have, again, in the spirit of kind of moving forward and kind of learning lessons, we have created a broader team with more specialist skill sets, and I think it's worked very well across this. It's worked very well across this window.
Was Victor a single point of failure then? Just to look at the counterpoint of what you described there, and when I say single point of failure, I don't mean he was necessarily an out-and-out failure. I mean, like, just in terms of how that phrase operates. I mean,
Victor had a huge amount of responsibility, and I think it's not reflective of him. It's just more reflective of how we've seen other clubs operate. We're actually having a flatter, broader structure probably dissipates the risk across a number of specialists.
But would you agree that by having Victor in charge of so much, that there was in him, if it starts to go wrong in one day, but if the recruitment's not quite up to scratch or whatever, then that falls away. And then you could find, in the sense that, Marsh was his man, for example, when it came to the manager, and he doubles down when Marsh is potentially going to be sacked. So suddenly you've got 2 points there. There's the manager, there's the recruitment, and it's all centering on one figure. Did he have too much control?
Yeah, well, I mean, we've that's why we looked at other structures, other football structures across other clubs, and see how they've done it best. And I think if you look at most clubs now, there is not one person who is running such a sophisticated and complicated department. It is spread across more people. So we think that's a better structure.
You mentioned before about football clubs being well run, and obviously your own role in this is at the top of the tree as the CEO. There are Leeds fans out there who will be disappointed that you're still here. And so what's your message to them?
Well, I think over it's difficult to hide from the disappointment of last season, and you can't hide from taking responsibility of it. I'm the chief executive. I'm responsible for the operation of the club. I'm responsible for managing the ownership and helping guide them in the right direction. And last season was a failure, and it's hugely disappointing personally, because it makes for a miserable year. And it's not what we set out to achieve. But I think if you look at, and it's difficult to just then not come up with a list of excuses of why it went wrong. And these aren't excuses, because there aren't anyway, because we were well funded enough, we had enough in the transfer market, we had enough choice and time of manager to get all those things right, and we didn't. But I think there is some context, and for me the context is that effectively the way the Premier League is structured now is there are 12 teams that are going to go down could go down every season. There's 8 that are probably safe, and there's 12 who are going down. Each of those has pretty much a fairly equal chance of going down. So your chance of going down are about 25%. So I think over 3 to 4 years, there's a chance that one year the bullet is going to be in your barrel of the revolver, and so I think you have to plan a club. If it's not going to be in the top 8, you have to be able to plan a club to be able to sustain a relegation and to take that as a course of business, because the margins are so fine. If you get one thing wrong, if you get an injury at the wrong time, if a manager doesn't work out, as Southampton have found, I think they've been in the Premier League for 10 years, as Leicester have found, who've won the Premier League and won an FA Cup, they weren't immune to it, as West Ham have flirted with it and Brighton have flirted with it. You need to build a structure which I think can withstand it, and therefore one relegation I don't think should be viewed as a terminal failure. And when I look at the time that I've been involved in the club, we've had 6 years. We've had the first year was a year of transition. The second year we were in the top 2 we were one of the 2 top teams in the league, and we failed in the playoffs. But I think it was a fantastic season that everyone enjoyed. We then had a wonderful year of getting promoted off the backdrop of COVID, which was a particularly challenging environment. And I think that was a season that everyone will remember. We then had a wonderful season where we finished ninth. And then we had a season that was disappointing because we stayed up by one place. But actually, in the context of teams that have got promoted, staying up in over 2 years would be deemed successful. So I think out of the first 5 years, we had one average one of transition. We had 4 relatively successful ones, or very successful to relatively successful, and we've had 1 year which was definitely a failure. When I look at people in my position, people at Norwich or people at Fulham or people at Watford who've gone down and come back up, I think there's a lot to be said for continuity. And I think anybody who knows anybody who actually knows me and interacts with me knows I love the club. I've had lots of opportunities to work at other clubs, and I don't want to work anywhere elsewhere because I love the club I'm at. And I think I've played a valuable role in helping transition the ownership. I think we've got great ownership now. Not that we didn't before, but I think the time was right that we needed to move to a different level of funding. And I'm really excited about the season. I think it's going to be, it will have some ups and downs. It's going to be nerve-wracking as it always is, but I could be more excited about working with Daniel and the players we've signed to make us successful again. And I think when we do get promoted, which I think will certainly should happen over the next 2 years, the foundation that we've built over the last 3 to 4 years won't be lost, because we have a stadium which is Premier League ready. We have stadium plans to take it to the next level. We have a training ground which is fixed. We've learnt some lessons in terms of football structure. So I think there's lots to be. I think it's hard off the backdrop of last season, but I think there's lots to be optimistic about.
Do you think maybe with hindsight the programme notes didn't help your own cause?
Well, that's why they've stopped. I think the sad thing on the programme notes was I think I made a conscious decision that it would be a good way of, rather than them being written. I think every other club chief executive, someone in the comms office writes them, and they're sort of a generic get behind the boys, type stuff. And what I wanted to do was use it as a sort of regular platform to hear from the ownership, and I think lots of people appreciated it. I think there were. I tried to put some personality into it and make it a little bit irreverent, and maybe give my perspective on other things in the broader football world to make it interesting. And I got some positive feedback. And I think when everything's going well, they're seen as irreverent and mildly amusing. And when everything's not going well, you're seen as a Tory twat. And I think what we made the decision is in that I still last night I spent an hour and a half with the trust on a Q&A. My door is open to any group of supporters if they want to come in and meet, and I really value the communication and the feedback. But I think the programme notes became a kind of lightning rod for supporter discontent, and when they do that, they just become counterproductive.
Yeah, I think from my point of view, it's because, like, for example, around the strikers, where I think you wrote the one about the 2 international number 9s and Joffrey being the best young striking prospect, and it didn't kind of pass the eye test. What we ended up seeing on the pitch didn't reflect that, And again, it's always with the aid of hindsight, but people are never forgiving in that regard. It's just that it came across as like you were the smartest people in the room, and then further down the line we get relegated, and then people think, well, you're bloody not. The evidence suggests you're not.
And I think that's a sort of tonality thing, because I got a lot of grief about that particular article, and I think what I was actually saying at the time was we were looking for a forward. We knew we needed one. We weren't going to bring in just anybody, and this sort of feedback you get about why don't you just bring in a forward.
Or a left back, for example.
Or a left back. That's probably maybe easier to fix. But on the forward one, when you're in the Premier League, there are not many 20 goal a season. There are, and they play for Spurs and Liverpool. West Ham don't have an out-and-out centre forward. Brighton, until Evan Ferguson, didn't have an out-and-out centre forward. So this thing of, the point I was trying to make was, with Rodrigo, who ended up scoring 14 goals in the season that he was half injured for, which was, well in advance of anybody else and should have been enough to keep us up, is... there is a bit of a duty to be defensive of the players that you've got, and everybody just saying to you, all your forwards are shit. Well, they're not shit. Patrick is, a Premier League. He scored 17 goals in a Premier League season. There's not many people who've done that. Of course, he has his injury problems. I know it's not everyone's cup of tea. I know Rodrigo was played out of position for a while. But you just try to sort of make the point, you have to defend the team at some points and sort of say, I can't pile in on Junior Firpo because you guys don't like him. He's a professional who turns up every day for training and wants to give his best for Leeds United. So it's, from an ownership and board perspective, these are my colleagues and my employees, and I have a professional duty to them beyond being a fan, which I know fans won't want to hear. But saying that the young players that we've got coming through aren't good enough is not very constructive. Saying that the forwards we have aren't good enough is not very constructive. But, within the context, I was saying we are still looking for somebody. And, we will try and get somebody. And I don't know, was that the window we bought Willie Nonto in the end? I think it was. But I understand why fans don't like it, because they don't want to hear it. They prefer to sit with me in a pub and, sit with my 7-year-old son who, who's Leeds obsessed and tells me exactly what he thinks. So I get the feedback, firsthand. I took him to a game at Brentford last season, and we got cornered after the game by some supporters, and the language was quite choice for a 6-year-old. And we sort of got back to the car, and he was like a bit flustered by it all, and he just looked at me and said, Dad, why don't you just buy a left back? So the feedback, we get the feedback, but I think when you're speaking from a club perspective, you have to be respectful of all the people who work really hard to try and be the best for Leeds United, even if they're up against it at a certain point. And you have to do it in the face of the fact that some of the criticism that they are receiving is completely disproportionate to how they're contributing, and you have to try and counterbalance that. So some of the abuse that Patrick Bamford and his family have suffered is completely off the charts of what anybody should have to face in English football, let alone somebody who's just got a slightly bad injury record. So I think in the programme notes sometimes you have to defend the decisions of the club and some of the people in the club, and I understand how that riles people. So I don't know. You can read the Adam Pope column instead now.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always from the point of view that the previous 16 years, the pre-Bielsa era, post-Premier League, pre-Bielsa era, was basically a shit show, and everyone's very, very damaged by it and doesn't trust the club and doubts what is being said within the club, doubts the sincerity of it. I think that's the place where it probably originates from.
I think it comes into a bigger picture as well sometimes, I think, of the things not going well on the pitch is obviously an element of it, but then you have the programme notes, which some people will take exception to. You have the owner of the club occasionally having a few too many glasses of red wine and replying to random fans on an evening, and it just and generally speaking, it was either came across as arrogant or just unprofessional. And then you have Victor Orta berating people in the West Stand or yelling "No Premier League without me" at people at Brentford.
Exactly,
and the whole picture it paints is of almost. It's almost the club themselves sometimes doing a them and us bit with the fans, and it's like there needs to be an understanding of why people are annoyed at Victor Orta, and him just yelling back at them doesn't achieve anything. Like I can, because you're generally in the background on these videos and pictures, kind of grimacing. I get the impression your opinion is just shut up, Victor. Like just take it now. Maybe their points are not fair, but the West Stand after a game is not the place to do this.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are. I think, and maybe it was a mistake, but at the start, I think Leeds had such poor ownership that we felt there was a need for the ownership to engage directly with the fan base, to give them some level of confidence that it was people who cared about it and were going to try and do the right thing. And that was against everything that I'd learned at West Ham and Arsenal, which is basically ownership and senior management should be seen and not heard. Be at the games and shut up, because no one wants to hear from you. And when it does go well, you won't get any credit, and when it goes badly, you'll be blamed. So you're best just to out it. But we felt there was a need, and I was a very reluctant part of the documentary, because I didn't want to be in it, and I didn't want the profile. But I think Andrea was keen to tell the story and tell the world that we were working really hard to try and make something special happen, and the documentary was, I think, was a sort of successful showcase of what we had achieved. But I think going forward, bar once a year coming in to speak to you guys, bar meeting fans, and to be honest, what I find is that it's much better to have a dialogue with supporters one-on-one in small groups. Supporters know I go to most of the games by public transport, so they'll see me on tubes on the way into London, or trains on the way back, to and from Leeds. And those are the discussions which I think are the most valid, because people can understand the context. They can decide whether there's some integrity behind it. They can see whether you're making a joke or being serious. And I think for us it's the way forward, which is we want to we don't want to be we don't want to have a closed door to the supporters, and we have the supporters advisory board now, which all the guys on the supporters advisory board do a fantastic job, give us a whole load of time, a whole load of commitment, really constructive feedback, and it's a great format to understand where fans are. But I don't think I think more broadly, the less you hear from us, the better, and the more you hear from what's happening on the pitch and from Daniel, I think is the way forward.
Final question then, and we'll let you go. Are we dicking about with the playoffs this year? I'd really like to think we can secure automatic promotion, and everything that I've seen from Daniel, everything that I've seen from the squad has just reinforced that belief. So I'm getting, I get more confident by the day. I'm really pleased with the transfer window. I think, bear in mind how long Daniel's had with the team, how much transition he's had to manage, the new players that he's had to bring in. I'm really excited for what we can do after the international break. What I would say is that I think people have to remember, in the years that we got promoted, we had some really tricky spots. Like, people seem to forget about it, but there were games. I remember Patrick missing a penalty away at QPR. I don't know, we lost 1-0, or and the fan base were like, "It's all over. It's not going to happen. We're going down." So I think this league will have moments where we will it will dent our confidence. But I'm from what I see from behind the scenes, I'm really confident that we should be able to secure automatic promotion. Fingers crossed. Thanks for coming down, Angus.
Pleasure, guys.
The Square Ball Podcast.